The entire company was at a standstill. The new CEO, Gustavo, was about to lose everything because the main vault password was lost. In panic, he humiliated the new young cleaner, Bianca, saying she was too dumb to understand what was happening. Seeing the chaos, she dropped the mop, walked to the safe, and to everyone's mockery, began typing. And the sound the door made next sealed the CEO's fate. The air in the boardroom of Ironclad Dynamics was heavy, dense with the smell of stale, reheated coffee and palpable desperation. Grant Baston felt the weight of every pair of eyes fixed on him, a mixture of pity and accusation that burned his skin. These were the eyes of the executive board, men who had served his father, Arthur, for decades, and who now viewed him as a spoiled brat poised to demolish a lifetime's legacy. In the corner of the room, the brushed steel safe seemed to mock him, a silent monolith guarding the secret that could either save or ruin everything. Locked inside was the original founding document, the key to the merger that represented the company's only lifeline. Without it, the investors would pull back and the empire his father built from nothing would crumble to dust. The entire family fortune, the vast Baston legacy, hinged on a single piece of paper locked behind a code that had died with Arthur. Days had bled into a week of agony. Technicians, security experts, even a retired professional safecracker who had cost him a small fortune in fees, all had failed. With every frustrated attempt, Grant felt control drain through his fingers like fine sand. He slammed his closed fist onto the massive mahogany table, making the porcelain cups rattle. "Incompetent fools! Every last one of them!" he bellowed, his voice echoing in the silent room. "How is it possible that no one can open a simple metal box?" He surged to his feet, pacing like a caged animal, his expensive suit wrinkled from the tension. His business was on the brink of collapse, and the only thing separating his family from ruin was a forgotten sequence of numbers. It was at that instant the door creaked open, a nearly imperceptible sound. A slender young woman, wearing faded blue cleaning scrubs, entered the room, pushing a wheeled bucket. This was Brianna, the new janitor. No one paid her any mind. She was merely part of the furniture, a shadow moving along the edges of the crisis. She began her work silently, the mop head gliding across the marble floor with a soft, steady rhythm. However, as she passed the corner of the room, she paused. For one fatal second, her gaze fixed on the safe. That was enough. Grant, desperately searching for a target for his accumulated fury, spun toward her. "What are you looking at, girl?" he snapped, his voice laden with venom. The sound made everyone flinch. Brianna jumped, her brown eyes wide. "Do you think your airhead brain can succeed where experts have failed? Get back to mopping the floor. That's the only skill you possess." The humiliation was public and biting. The directors looked away, embarrassed. A tear of rage and shame might have sprung to anyone else's eyes, but not to Brianna's. She took a deep breath, a surprising calm settling over her features. Slowly, she let go of the mop handle, which tapped softly against the bucket. She dried her trembling hands on her apron and, ignoring the stunned looks, walked with firm, decisive steps toward the safe. "What now?" Grant scoffed, crossing his arms, a sneer plastered across his face. "Going to try 1, 2, 3, 4? Get out of the way, you worthless kid." But she didn't stop. She stood before the cold metal, ignoring the fury emanating from the air, and raised her hand toward the numeric keypad. The silence in the room was so deep that the sound of Brianna's fingers touching the safe's digital keys seemed amplified, each touch a small crack in the void. Grant watched, a smirk of superiority still dancing on his lips, waiting for the inevitable sound of the error, the red light that would confirm his worldview. The directors shifted in their leather chairs, a collective discomfort hanging over them. What did this girl think she was doing? Hadn't the humiliation been enough? Brianna, however, seemed to be in her own universe, oblivious to the scorn and tension. Her fingers moved with unnerving familiarity, a confidence that belied her position. 8 digits, 8 small clicks. Time seemed to freeze. The red light flashed one last time, and then, like a sigh of relief, turned green. A soft, metallic click cut the air, and the heavy steel door unlatched, moving an inch outward. The entire room gasped, a single audible sound. Grant's smirk froze and dissolved, replaced by a mask of pure disbelief, his skin drained of color, turning pale as wax. "How?" he stammered, the word dragging, stripped of his usual arrogance. "How did you know that number?" Brianna did not rush. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his without fear or hesitation. For the first time, her voice resonated in the boardroom, not as a whisper, but firm and clear, cutting through the incredulity like a knife. "Because 10/22/1975 isn't the company's founding date, Grant," she said, each word falling like a stone. "It's the date our father and my mother sold her 75 Plymouth Duster to put the down payment on this very room." The revelation hung in the air, loaded with a weight no one there could fully comprehend. Our father. The confusion on Grant's face deepened, twisting into impotent fury. What was this madness? Before he could explode again, a figure moved in the corner of the room. It was Mr. Montgomery, the family's lawyer for over 40 years. A man whose discretion and loyalty to Arthur were legendary. He stood, adjusting his thin-rimmed glasses, and walked to the open safe, his face a mask of solemn seriousness. "She is correct, Grant," he said in his grave voice, his calm contrasting with the emotional chaos that had erupted. He reached into the safe and pulled out an aged leather portfolio. "Your father always knew about your arrogance. He left the main will to you, but he placed the original partnership agreement here." He opened the folder on the mahogany table, revealing a time-yellowed document. The air seemed thinner. Every second stretched into an eternity. Grant felt his heart hammer against his ribs. The founding document, salvation. But Mr. Montgomery's gaze was not one of relief. It was a look of deep, sad resignation, like a messenger about to deliver devastating news. He cleared his throat, and the sound seemed like thunder in the silent room. He looked from Grant to Brianna, and then to the document in his hands. "Your father owned 49% of the shares," he began, and the first part of the revelation hit Grant like a punch. "The remaining 51%, the controlling interest, belongs to the co-founder and majority partner of the company." Mr. Montgomery paused, lifting his eyes to face Grant directly, letting the weight of his next words settle even before they were spoken. The lawyer's pause lasted only an instant, but in that brief silence, Grant Baston's world shattered into 1,000 pieces. He lifted his gaze from the yellow document and fixed it on the trembling figure of the janitor. "Your half-sister, whom he kept secret to protect her from you, Brianna." If lightning had struck inside the boardroom, the shock would not have been greater. The words echoed, bouncing off the mahogany walls, the pale faces of the directors, and Grant's frozen heart. Brianna, the janitor, his sister, the majority shareholder. It was a nightmare, a sick joke. He let out a laugh, a hollow, desperate sound. "This is ridiculous! A sham! A con!" he spat, pointing a trembling finger at Brianna. This opportunist! She must have tricked my father on his deathbed. Mr. Montgomery, how could you lend yourself to this circus?" But the lawyer remained impassive. "There is no sham, Grant. Everything is here, legally constituted and authenticated over 20 years ago. Arthur loved your mother, Helena, and he loved the daughter he had with her. He knew that your temperament, your greed, would destroy her if you knew of her existence. He wanted to ensure Brianna had a quiet life, away from your influence. But he was also a fair man. The original idea, the seed capital, the drive to start all this, came from Helena, and that inheritance, by right, belongs to her daughter. Brianna, for her part, was just as stunned as Grant, but for completely different reasons. She knew she was Arthur Baston's daughter. Her mother had told her the story before she passed away, a story of forbidden love and silent sacrifice. She had come to the company not for money, but to see the place her father built, to feel close to him somehow. She hoped, perhaps, to find a glimpse of the man her mother loved so much. Never, in her wildest dreams, did she imagine she held control of this entire empire. The weight of 51% of the shares settled upon her shoulders like a mountain. She looked at her own hands, calloused from hard work, and then at Grant's face, contorted in a mask of hatred. The directors, previously loyal to Grant for his surname, now looked at her differently. The initial shock gave way to cold calculation. Power had changed hands. Loyalty in the business world always follows capital. Brianna felt their appraising stares, their minds working, recalculating the company's future and their own careers. She was now the central piece on the chessboard, and she had no idea how to play. The humiliation of minutes ago dissipated, replaced by a dizzying fear. I didn't know any of this," she whispered, her voice weak, directed more at herself than anyone else in the room. Grant lunged toward her, his face red with fury. "Liar! You planned this whole thing!" He was interrupted by Brianna's calm, firm voice. As she lifted her head, a new determination emerging amidst the chaos. "Grant," she said, using his first name without ceremony, making him halt. "You're fired." The silence that followed was absolute. Grant stared at her, dumbfounded, the fury giving way to complete stupefaction. "Now," Brianna continued, her voice gaining strength, "please call someone to clean up the mess you've made in this room." She wasn't referring to the spilled coffee or scattered papers. It was the mess of his arrogance, of his contempt, that now stained his father's legacy. Grant stood paralyzed for a moment, his brain unable to process the total inversion of power. Then, a dangerous glint lit up his eyes. He wouldn't say anything more here, not in front of his board, who now looked at his half-sister as the new queen. He turned abruptly and marched toward the door, but stopped with his hand on the knob, his body tense with contained rage. He looked over his shoulder, his face shadowed with a silent promise. "This isn't over," he hissed, the words heavy with threat. "You may have the papers, but you'll never have my place. I will ruin you." With that, he slammed the door shut with a force that made the pictures on the wall tremble, leaving Brianna alone with the weight of an empire she never wanted and a brother who had just become her greatest enemy. The echo of Grant's door slam reverberated through the room before being swallowed by a heavy, expectant silence. Brianna remained standing in the center of that universe of mahogany and leather, feeling like a fraud. Her blue uniform seemed to burn her skin, a stark reminder that minutes ago, her biggest problem was a coffee stain on the carpet. Now, she owned all of it. The directors, middle-aged men in impeccable suits, watched her with an intensity that dissected her. There was no longer pity or embarrassment in their eyes, but cold, calculating assessment. Power had shifted, and they needed to recalibrate their alliances. A man with grey hair and an astute face, whom Brianna recognized as Richard. The chief financial officer rose and took a step forward, breaking the silence. "Ms. Baston," he began, his voice smooth and professional, but with an underlying tone of condescension. The name sounded strange, like a shoe that didn't fit. "This is, without a doubt, a stunning revelation. However, the company's situation remains critical. The merger with Nexus Global isn't just a growth opportunity. It is our only chance for survival. Without their capital injection, our cash flow will collapse in a matter of weeks." The words hit her like a blast of cold wind. Merger, capital, cash flow. These were terms from a world that wasn't hers. Her world was made up of paying bills. the rent for the small apartment she shared with her cat, and the dream of one day opening a small cafe. The fortune she inherited didn't feel real. It was an abstract number, a concept, but the fear on those men's faces was palpable. The weight of responsibility for their jobs, for their families, began to crush her. Mr. Montgomery approached, subtly positioning himself between Brianna and the directors, like a shield. "Richard, give the young woman a moment. This is a lot to assimilate." He turned to Brianna, his eyes gentle behind the lenses. "Brianna, your father knew this day might come. He left a letter for you. It's in my office. He wanted you to know..." But Richard interrupted him. Urgency overriding courtesy. "With all due respect, Mr. Montgomery, we don't have time. The revelation of the new majority partner complicates everything. The Nexus board was negotiating with Grant. They trusted his aggression. They expect a leader." He looked directly at Brianna, and for the first time, she saw something beyond calculation in his eyes. Panic. "Our meeting with them is tomorrow, 9 a.m. They flew in from New York City exclusively for this. If we cancel, or if we show up without clear, competent leadership in charge, they will withdraw the offer, and then everything will be lost. The entire legacy, the shares, all of this," he gestured around the room, "will be worthless." The room seemed to spin. Tomorrow, less than 24 hours, she would have to sit at a table with multimillionaires, seasoned negotiators who expected to find a shark like Grant and would instead find her, a janitor, a girl who had never managed anything larger than her own modest budget. Despair threatened to suffocate her. How could she possibly do this? It was a sentence of failure. She looked at the faces around the table. They didn't see her as a savior, but as the final obstacle, the last nail in ironclad Dynamics' coffin. Her father's inheritance wasn't a gift. It was a trap, an impossible test designed to see her fail spectacularly. The word tomorrow hung in the air like a judgment. Brianna felt the floor disappear beneath her feet, the directors' faces blurred into a smudge of disapproval and panic. They saw her as the cause of the imminent disaster, an anomaly that would break the fragile business equilibrium. The weight of that inheritance wasn't about money or power. It was about the overwhelming responsibility for thousands of lives depending on her non-existent competence. She felt like a fraud, wearing the skin of a queen while her soul still belonged to Cinderella. Her capital, in that moment, was fear. A fear so profound that it paralyzed her, stealing her air and her voice. Just as the pressure in the room became unbearable, Mr. Montgomery's calm voice cut the tension. "Tomorrow's meeting will proceed as planned," he declared, with an authority that surprised everyone. He stood beside Brianna, a pillar of serenity in the midst of the storm. "Ms. Baston will be present and will represent the majority interests of the company. Now, if you'll excuse us, she needs time to prepare and to familiarize herself with her father's affairs. I dismiss all of you for today." The directors exchanged incredulous glances, but no one dared challenge the man who had guarded Arthur Baston's secrets for 4 decades. One by one, they rose, gathering their leather briefcases. Their glances at Brianna, a mixture of resentment and morbid curiosity, as if waiting to witness an inevitable train wreck. Richard was the last to leave, pausing at the door. "Doctor, I hope you know what you're doing," he said, the warning clear in his voice. "The future of all of us is at stake." When the door closed, the silence that remained was different, less hostile. It was a silence of anticipation. "Come with me, my dear," Mr. Montgomery said. The word dear, spoken with a paternal affection that made Brianna's eyes sting. He guided her out of the boardroom and down a quiet hallway to his office. The place was a sanctuary of order and history. The walls were lined with law books. The air smelled of antique paper and furniture wax. On the dark wood desk, a portrait of a younger, smiling Arthur seemed to watch them. "Please sit," Brianna obeyed. feeling like a small child. The lawyer poured her a glass of water, his hands steady. "Your father didn't do this to punish you, Brianna. He did this because he saw in you the strength your mother had, a strength that Grant, with all his education and ambition, never possessed. He feared wealth had corrupted him." He sat across from her and opened a drawer, pulling out a thick, yellowed envelope sealed with the Baston family crest. "He gave this to me 5 years ago. He said that if anything happened to him, I was to ensure it reached your hands, but only if you proved worthy of finding it." He extended the envelope. The safe code was the test. Brianna's hands trembled so much she could barely hold the envelope. The elegant script on the front simply read, "To my star, Brianna." A single tear rolled down her face. With shaking fingers, she broke the seal. Inside, there was not only a letter, there was also a small, ancient brass key. She unfolded the paper and began to read her father's strong, angular handwriting. "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, it is because the safe obeyed you. It only obeys those who have the Baston heart. But heart is not enough to command." Her eyes darted to the key in her palm. The letter continued, "The key you hold opens the lowest drawer of my old desk here in the office. What is inside is the only weapon you will have against Grant, and the only chance to save this company." The small brass key felt cold and heavy in Brianna's palm, a relic of a past she was only beginning to uncover. Her father's words echoed in her mind, a mixture of warning and hope. The desk, the weapon, the only chance. With a pounding heart, she stood up, her gaze fixed on the imposing mahogany desk that dominated the room, the same desk that had been the nerve center of Arthur Baston's empire. Mr. Montgomery watched in silence, his wise eyes revealing deep emotion, as if witnessing the unfolding of a long-laid plan. Brianna rounded the desk, her fingers brushing the polished wood, feeling the energy of decades of decisions, risks, and triumphs that the furniture had witnessed. She knelt, the fabric of her uniform dragging on the Persian rug. The lowest drawer was discreet, almost concealed by the wood ornamentation. The lock was small, old, almost forgotten. With a trembling hand, she inserted the key. She turned it. A soft, dry click broke the silence. Slowly, she pulled the drawer open. The interior was lined with dark blue velvet, and resting upon it was a single object, a thick, black, leather-bound journal, visibly worn from use. There was no gold, no stock certificates, no crypto wallet passwords, just a diary. The disappointment was a physical blow. Was this the weapon? A notebook. She picked it up, the leather cover soft and familiar to the touch. Opening it, she immediately recognized her father's handwriting, strong and angular, filling every page. But the content left her perplexed. These were not notes on business, investment strategies, or expansion plans. It was a meticulous, almost obsessive record of every single failure, every error in judgment, every disastrous decision Grant had made since joining the company. Every bad investment that resulted in a loss, every arrogant negotiation that cost the company valuable contracts, every opportunity missed due to sheer negligence. Arthur had documented everything with dates, amounts, and the consequences of each act. It was a devastating dossier on his own son's incompetence. "Why would he do this?" Brianna whispered, flipping through the pages, each one a nail in the coffin of Grant's reputation as a business genius. "Because he loved him," Mr. Montgomery replied, his voice soft. "Arthur saw the potential in Grant, but he also saw the poison of arrogance growing in him. He tried to advise him, tried to guide him, but Grant never listened. This diary was not written out of anger, Brianna. It was written with pain. It was your father's hope that one day Grant might read this and finally see himself, learn from his mistakes. But Arthur was also a practical man. He knew this record might be the only way to protect the company, from his own son, if necessary. Brianna closed the journal, the weight of the knowledge pressing down on her. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a final act by a father torn between the love for his two children. To use that diary in tomorrow's meeting would be like detonating a bomb. It would expose Grant, destroy his reputation before the Nexus Global Board. But what kind of victory would that be? A victory built on the ruin of her own brother. She felt caught in an impossible moral dilemma. On one side, the survival of the company and its employees. On the other, the public destruction of a member of her family, no matter how cruel he had been to her. As she wrestled with her conscience, the phone on Mr. Montgomery's desk rang, a jarring sound that made her jump. The lawyer answered, listened for a moment, and his face darkened. He hung up and looked at Brianna. "That was Richard," he said, his voice grave. "Nexus Global has moved up the meeting. They want to meet us in 1 hour, and they demanded Grant's presence. It seems your brother hasn't wasted any time. He's already making his move to undermine you. 1 hour, 60 minutes to transform from janitor to CEO, to absorb decades of an industry totally alien to her." Panic was a cold claw gripping Brianna's chest. Mr. Montgomery, sensing her state, acted with impressive calm. He led her to the now empty boardroom, spreading reports on the table. "You don't need to know everything," he said, pointing to charts and spreadsheets. "Just the essentials. This is our cash flow, here are our primary assets, and these are the liabilities choking us. Nexus's proposal covers our debt and promises investment in exchange for majority control." Grant negotiated the terms. Every word was an incomprehensible buzz. Her father's diary was in her bag, heavy as an anchor. The temptation to use it, to simply annihilate Grant and postpone the problem, was immense. But the image of her father's face in the photograph, a mixture of strength and sadness, restrained her. In the car, heading toward the mirrored high-rise of the downtown Chicago financial district, Brianna felt every mile as a countdown to her execution. Mr. Montgomery drove in silence, offering silent support that was worth more than any advice. Entering the marble and steel lobby, they felt like fish out of water. Ironclad dynamics was solid, old school, smelling of oil and hard work. Nexus Global was cold, impersonal, smelling of money and power. They were escorted to a conference room on the top floor with a panoramic view of the city. And there he was, Grant, impeccably dressed, chatting animatedly with a silver-haired man with a predatory smile. He seemed to be in his element. Seeing Brianna enter, a triumphant smile crossed his face. "Brianna, what a surprise," he said, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. "Did you come to serve the coffee?" The silver-haired man, Sterling Vance, CEO of Nexus, extended a hand to her, but his gaze was icy. "Miss Baston, I hear there has been a change in the equity structure." The meeting began. Vance presented the plan with the fluidity of a master. He spoke of synergy, optimization, maximizing shareholder profit. Sleek charts showed projections of growing profitability and dividends. Grant nodded, exultant. Brianna felt smaller and smaller, an imposter about to be unmasked. She was lost. They were speaking a language she didn't understand. Then Vance said the phrase that changed everything. "Of course, to achieve this efficiency, we will conduct a complete re-evaluation of Ironclad's assets. The main factory floor, for instance, has huge real estate potential, and the human capital will be optimized." Optimized. The word sounded like an alarm bell in Brianna's head. She didn't understand stock markets or investment funds, but she understood people. She knew the faces of the factory workers, the cleaners who, like her, labored to pay the bills. Optimize didn't mean training, it meant firing. And real estate potential meant closing the factory. A wave of clarity hit her with the force of a punch. They didn't want to save the company. They wanted to dismantle it, sell its assets, suck out every last drop of value, and leave behind an empty shell. It was a hostile acquisition disguised as a merger, and Grant, in his eagerness to prove his worth and close a multi-million-dollar deal, had been blind. He wasn't saving the company, he was selling its soul. The diary in her bag suddenly seemed insignificant. The enemy wasn't just her brother's arrogance, it was the smiling shark across the table, in an impulse, driven by a force she didn't know she possessed. She leaned forward. "Excuse me, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice surprisingly loud in the silence of the room. "I have a question." All eyes in the room turned to Brianna. Grant glared at her, a clear warning to remain silent. Sterling Vance, the Nexus CEO, raised an eyebrow, a slight smile of amusement on his lips, as if indulging a child's whim. "By all means, Miss Baston," he said, the tone condescending. Brianna felt her heart hammer, but the image of Ironclad's employees gave her unexpected strength. She ignored Grant and looked directly at Vance. "You mentioned the real estate potential of the main factory site. I would like to know, in your plan for optimization, what percentage of Ironclad's current workforce would be retained after the merger?" The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and brutally effective. The politeness of corporate language was shredded, exposing the raw truth underneath. Vance's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That is an operational matter that would be defined at a later stage," Vance began, trying to deflect. But Brianna didn't back down. "With all due respect, sir, that doesn't seem like an operational matter, but a fundamental one. Our company's greatest asset is not the land, it's the people, men and women who have dedicated their lives to Ironclad, entire families. Before we sign anything, I need a number." The room fell silent. Mr. Montgomery watched her with a mixture of surprise and pride. Grant looked about to explode. The facade of competent leader he had built was being undermined not by charts or numbers, but by a question he never thought to ask. Vance sighed, abandoning cordiality. "Look, Ms. Baston, the business world is like this. To create wealth, to generate profit, sometimes cuts are necessary. The factory is old, inefficient. Maintaining the operation as is would be an unviable investment. So your intention was never to save the company, but to liquidate its assets," Brianna pressed, her voice firm. "This isn't a merger, it's a dismantlement." Grant finally intervened, his voice tight with rage and humiliation. "Brianna, that's enough. You don't understand business. We're talking about a fortune at stake, a chance to become billionaires. We can't let stupid sentimentality mess up the biggest deal in our history. Our business, Grant," she turned to him, and for the first time, he saw in her not the janitor, but Arthur Baston's daughter. "Our business is forging steel, building parts, honoring the sweat of every employee who walks through that gate. That's what our father built. And you were about to sell it all for a handful of dollars so that he," she pointed at Vance, "could build luxury condos on the legacy of our family." The accusation hit him square. For the first time, Grant's unwavering certainty began to crack. He looked at Vance, then at the papers in front of him, as if seeing them from a new perspective. He had focused so much on profitability, dividends, and the prestige of closing a major deal that he never questioned Nexus's true intentions. Sterling Vance realized he had lost control. He stood up, adjusting his expensive suit. "It appears Ironclad's board has internal disagreements to resolve. When you have a unified position, contact us. But we won't wait forever." He and his team left the room, leaving behind a silence charged with tension. Grant wasn't looking at Brianna. He stared at the city view through the panoramic window, but saw nothing. The image of himself, the visionary, the business genius, was shattering. He had been deceived, manipulated, and the only person who saw it was the sister he despised. "What have I done?" he whispered to the glass, his voice broken. The room door opened again. It wasn't Vance. It was Richard, ironclad CFO, his face pale as a ghost. "I have terrible news," he said, his voice trembling. "One of our biggest creditors learned of the impasse with Nexus. They are demanding immediate payment of our entire debt. We have 24 hours to raise capital we don't have. If we fail, they will file for bankruptcy." The word bankruptcy sucked all the oxygen out of the room. It was a verdict, final and absolute. Richard, the CFO, was pale, his hands shaking as he held the cell phone that had delivered the devastating news. Mr. Montgomery closed his eyes for an instant, his face etched with worry. Brianna felt a wave of nausea. She had saved the company from Vance's clutches, only to throw it into an even deeper abyss. Her father's inheritance had turned to ashes in her hands. It was Grant who moved first. The shock seemed to reanimate him, replacing his existential crisis with a visceral sense of urgency. This was his territory, the crisis, the numbers, the edge of the cliff. "What is the exact amount they want?" he asked Richard, his voice hoarse, but with the tone of command back. 50 million, Dace," Richard replied, the amount sounding absurd, impossible. "It's the principal plus accrued interest. They know the news of the failed merger will leak. They're jumping ship before it sinks." Grant rushed to the table, opening his laptop with feverish speed. His fingers flew over the keyboard, opening spreadsheets, analyzing cash flow, assets, liabilities. "Our liquid assets. What do we have in cash, in short-term investments?" Richard shook his head. "It barely covers next month's payroll. All our working capital was tied up in the expectation of the Nexus investment. And the banks. An emergency line of credit," Grant insisted, hope diminishing with every answer. "Our credit rating was already bad, Grant. After this, it'll be terrible. No bank will loan us that amount without real collateral. And our assets are already collateralized against other debts. Our net worth is compromised." Brianna watched the frantic exchange, lost amid terms she barely understood. But she understood the desperation on her brother's face. He was no longer the arrogant CEO. He was a man fighting desperately to save the ship he himself had helped damage. For the first time, she saw not an enemy, but a reflection of her own anguish. Her father's legacy was dying before her eyes. "Isn't there anyone?" she asked, her quiet voice making the two men stop and look at her. "Someone who trusted Dad? A friend? An old business partner?" Grant let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Brianna, the business world doesn't operate on friendship. It operates on profitability and interest. No one will risk a fortune out of sentimentality." He leaned back in his chair, his energy depleted, defeat stamped on his face. He closed his laptop with a dull thump. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow. "There's no way out. It's mathematically impossible. No investment fund, no bank, no multi-millionaire in their right mind would give us that money. We'd need a miracle." The room plunged into a funeral silence. Hope had died. While the men stared into the financial abyss, Brianna's eyes were drawn to the black-covered journal she had left on the table, her father's weapon. She picked it up, the worn leather comforting her trembling fingers. It wasn't a book about success, but about mistakes, and about how her father thought. An idea, fragile and absurd, began to form, a spark amidst the darkness. It wasn't an idea based on finance, but on people, on trust. She raised her gaze to the desolate faces of Grant and Mr. Montgomery. "Maybe," she began, her voice little more than a whisper, "maybe there is a way." Grant looked at Brianna as if she had lost her mind. "A way," he repeated, his voice heavy with exhausted skepticism. "Brianna, there is no way. Richard and I, who have spent our entire lives dealing with finance, are telling you it's the end of the line. What magic trick do you think you can pull out of a hat?" Mr. Montgomery, however, watched her with attentive curiosity. He had witnessed her unexpected wisdom once and wasn't willing to dismiss her so quickly. Brianna ignored Grant's contempt and opened her father's journal on the table, flipping through the pages, not to the notes about Grant's errors, but to others, notes that had previously seemed unimportant. They were profiles, brief descriptions of the oldest employees. Old man Clarence, master welder, she read aloud, 35 years with the company, knows the mood of every machine just by the sound, loyal, reliable, invested his life here. She turned the page. Inez, head of logistics, 28 years, never a counting error, the heart of the supply chain, the soul of the company. She looked up. What Nexus wanted was our physical assets, the land, the buildings, the goods. They called people human capital to be optimized, but they were wrong. Ironclad dynamics. True treasure isn't in our assets, it's in the people. That's lovely, Brianna. Poetic, but poetry doesn't pay creditors. Grant sneered. What are you getting at? What if... She hesitated, the idea still so fragile, so audacious. What if we asked them for help, not as a favor, but as an investment? Grant and Richard stared at her, dumbfounded. You're suggesting that the employees who earn a minimum wage to survive loan us $50 million? Grant laughed, a dry, joyless sound. That's the most absurd idea I've ever heard. Where would they get that kind of money? Not all $50 million, Brianna continued, conviction growing in her voice. But what if we offered them the chance to become owners of this place? What if we turned Ironclad into a cooperative? What if each of us, me, you, the directors, the employees, contributed what we could, sell a car, use savings, a small inheritance? Together, maybe we won't reach $50 million, but perhaps we can raise enough to show the creditor that we have a plan, that we have a future, and renegotiate the debt. A cooperative, Richard interjected, shocked. That would destroy the value of the stock. The market hates that kind of model. Our dividends would vanish. What dividends? Richard, Brianna retorted, in 24 hours, our shares will be worth less than the paper they're printed on. We are trying to save the company, not the fortune of a handful of shareholders. The question is, what is worth more? A piece of paper that says you own something that's about to go bankrupt, or a guaranteed job in a company that belongs to you and your colleagues? Mr. Montgomery cleared his throat, a twinkle in his eye. Arthur always said, he recalled, his voice thick with emotion, the greatest capital a man can have is the trust of those who walk beside him. He would be proud of this idea, Brianna. Grant was silent, a storm of emotions on his face. The cold logic of his world said the plan was financial suicide. But Brianna's logic, his father's logic, spoke to a part of him he had forgotten existed. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had signed orders, closed deals, and were now empty and useless. The idea was madness, a shot in the dark, but it was the only idea on the table. Slowly, he raised his head and looked at his sister. And how exactly do you intend to convince hundreds of workers to hand over the little they have to save the hides of an executive board they barely know? Brianna closed the journal and stood up. The decision made. I won't convince them. We will, and we won't do it from up here. We'll do it down there, on the factory floor. Now, descending from the top floor of the Nexus building to the floor of the Ironclad Dynamics factory was like crossing a universe. The cold, aseptic air of the corporate offices gave way to the pungent smell of hot oil, metal, and sweat. The tense silence of the meeting rooms was replaced by the deafening roar of the machines, an industrial symphony that was the company's beating heart. News of the failed merger and impending bankruptcy had spread like wildfire. When Brianna, Grant, Mr. Montgomery, and Richard entered the vast warehouse, the machines began to be switched off one by one. The noise subsided, giving way to a heavy silence, charged with fear and distrust. Hundreds of grease-smudged faces turned toward them, faces of men and women Brianna knew by sight, with whom she had exchanged greetings in the hallways. Now, they looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. To them, she was still the janitor, and her presence beside the big shots was an anomaly. A tall, corpulent man with arms like steel beams stepped forward. It was Old Man Clarence, the master welder the journal described. His eyes, accustomed to the glare of incandescent metal, were sharp and showed no fear. "What is happening?" he asked, his deep voice overcoming the murmurs. "Is it true? Is Ironclad closing?" Grant, by instinct, began to speak, his voice projected to command. "The situation is complex," he started, with the usual corporate jargon. But Brianna interrupted him with a gentle gesture. She knew those words wouldn't work here. She took a step forward, stopping beneath the yellowish light of the warehouse. She was no longer protected by the mahogany table. She was exposed, vulnerable, and that made her real to them. "Yes, it is true," she said, her voice clear and straightforward. "The company is in trouble." "Serious trouble?" She told the story, not the polished version from the financial reports, but the truth. She spoke of the Nexus proposal, the plan for dismantlement, the debt due in less than a day. She did not hide Grant's incompetence nor her own inexperience. She spoke with the honesty of someone who had nothing to lose. "They wanted to close this factory," she continued, gesturing to the silent machines. "They wanted to sell the ground you've worked on for decades. We said no, because Ironclad Dynamics is not a piece of land. It is us, all of us." Grant watched her, astonished. She spoke with a passion he had never possessed. She wasn't talking about shares or profitability, but about dignity, about legacy. She was no longer the janitor, she was their leader. "We don't have the money to pay the creditor," Brianna admitted. "The banks have closed their doors to us. And that is why we are here, not to give orders, but to ask for help." She explained her idea, the cooperative, the chance for each of them to become an owner of a piece of the company. A skeptical silence settled. Then, a woman in the crowd, Inez from logistics, shouted, "What guarantee do we have? We hand over our savings, and tomorrow you sell the company to another vulture." It was the crucial question. Trust had been broken. It was then that Grant did something no one expected. He stepped forward, stopping beside Brianna. He was pale, but his eyes held a new clarity. "I am the guarantee," he said, his voice surprisingly humble. He turned to Brianna. "I was a fool, arrogant, greedy. I nearly destroyed everything our father built. And you showed me what it means to be a real Baston." He then turned to the crowd. "I don't ask for your trust. I lost it, but I ask that you trust her. And as proof of my word," he took a key from his pocket. "This is the key to my condo, to my imported car. I will sell everything. Every penny of my personal wealth will be the first to go into this fund. I can lose my fortune, but I will not lose my father's legacy. Not again." The silence that followed was different. It was no longer skepticism. It was contemplation. They saw the raw sincerity on the face of the man they once despised. They saw the quiet strength in the woman they once ignored. It was no longer a question of money. It was a question of faith. Slowly, Old Man Clarence walked to a toolbox, took an old steel hard hat, and placed it upside down in the center of the factory floor. He took his wallet from his pocket, pulled out a few crumpled bills, and tossed them into the hard hat. A simple gesture, a vote of confidence. And then, one by one, others followed. The sound of crumpled bills and coins dropping into Old Man Clarence's steel hard hat was the start of a silent, powerful movement. One by one, the workers approached. They were small gestures, but loaded with immense meaning. A young man took the money he was saving for a motorcycle out of his pocket. An older woman, near retirement, pulled an envelope from her apron, her emergency savings. Rough, strong men, whose hands only knew hard labor, opened their wallets with surprising delicacy. It wasn't just money, it was delayed dreams, sacrifices, the materialization of the hope and trust they placed in Brianna. And, surprisingly, in the newly redeemed Grant. Brianna felt a lump in her throat, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to shed. This was Ironclad Dynamics' true treasure. It wasn't locked in a safe, but in the hearts of these people. Grant watched the scene, transformed. The arrogance that had defined him had dissolved, replaced by overwhelming humility. He now saw value that couldn't be measured in dollars or euros. He saw human capital not as a liability to be optimized, but as the most precious asset a company could possess. The hard hats soon overflowed. Cardboard boxes were brought, and the collection continued. The directors, including a visibly moved Richard, followed Grant's example, promising to liquidate their own shares and personal investments. The news spread through the offices. Administrative staff, engineers, secretaries, everyone came down to the factory floor, joining the movement. The company, once divided by hierarchies and positions, became a single entity, fighting for a common goal. Mr. Montgomery, with the help of Richard and some finance staff, improvised a counting center on a nearby table. With every hour, a new total was announced, and hope grew. But time was an unforgiving enemy. The 24-hour deadline was rapidly approaching. Late that afternoon, the final count was made. They had achieved an extraordinary feat, a miracle of solidarity, but it wasn't enough. 32 million, Mr. Montgomery announced, his voice heavy. It's a monumental sum, a testament to your strength. But we are still 18 million short. A collective sigh of disappointment swept through the warehouse. They had given everything they had, but the cold math was relentless. Bankruptcy, which had seemed so distant during that day of unity, returned as a threatening shadow. Grant, who had spent the last few hours on the phone with brokers and banks, trying to speed up the sale of his assets, approached the group, his face pale. My assets will take days to liquidate. I won't get the rest in time. It was at this moment of maximum tension, when all hope seemed lost, that a discreet black luxury car pulled up outside the factory gate. A middle-aged man, with a serene face and astute eyes, stepped out and entered the warehouse, observing the scene with silent interest. No one paid him much attention, thinking he might be a journalist or a lawyer. He walked calmly toward the group formed by Brianna, Grant, and Mr. Montgomery. He looked at the exhausted faces, the boxes of cash, and then his eyes fixed on Brianna. I heard an interesting story today, the man said, his voice calm, but with a tone of authority, about a janitor who became queen and who, instead of selling her kingdom, decided to share it with her people. It's a rather unusual business strategy. Brianna stared at him, confused. Excuse me, who are you? The man smiled. My name is Elias Thorne. I'm the principal shareholder of the creditor that is demanding your payment. The air seemed to thin out. The enemy was right there, among them. I came personally to execute the bankruptcy order. Elias Thorne's words fell like a granite slab onto the fragile hope that united everyone in the warehouse. The enemy wasn't in a distant boardroom. He was right here in the flesh to deliver the final blow. The murmur of despair was almost a collective moan. Faces that had glowed with the fervor of solidarity now contorted into a mask of defeat. All of it, all the sacrifice, had been in vain. Grant took a step forward, protective instinct overriding his despair. You can't do this. These people, he began, but his voice failed. What could he say? The law was on Thorne's side, but it was Brianna who stopped him, her hand on his arm, firm and calm. She turned to the man who held their destiny in his hands. There was no plea in her eyes, only quiet dignity. You have every right to do this, she said, her clear voice resonating in the deadly silence. The debt is legitimate, but before you sign the paper that ends the life of hundreds of families, I ask you to look around. She gestured to the cardboard boxes full of cash. This isn't a company's capital. It's its soul. It is proof that Ironclad Dynamics is worth more than its assets or liabilities. You can take our buildings, but you can't take this. Elias Thorne listened in silence, his face impassive. He walked slowly to one of the boxes, took a handful of crumpled bills, and let them sift through his fingers. "I manage one of the largest investment funds in the country," he said, without turning around. "I deal with billion-dollar deals, with risk analysis, with profitability projections. I've seen companies born and die, and in all my years, I have never seen anything like this." He turned around, and for the first time, a genuine smile touched his lips. The news of what was happening here swept the financial market like wildfire. No one believed it. A company on the brink of ruin, being saved by its own workers. It was unprecedented. He looked from Brianna to Grant. "Your creditor, the bank I manage, was ready to liquidate your shares and sell your assets. But I saw something different. I didn't see a failing company. I saw the rarest and most valuable of assets. Unshakable loyalty. That, ladies and gentlemen, is something no amount of money can buy." He walked back toward them. "I will cover the remaining 18 million T," he declared. A shout of disbelief and joy began to rise from the crowd, but he raised his hand. "But not as a gift. I want to come in as a partner. I want to invest in this cooperative of yours. I want a stake in this new business model that you created today. A model based not on greed, but on trust." Brianna and Grant looked at each other, astonished. Salvation had come from the most improbable source. It wasn't charity. It was a business proposal, a validation of their crazy idea. "We accept," Brianna said, her voice choked with emotion. A roar of celebration exploded in the warehouse, a sound so powerful it seemed it could lift the roof. Men and women hugged, crying and laughing at the same time. The tension of days dissolved in a wave of pure relief and joy. Amidst the celebration, Grant approached Brianna. "You did it," he said, the admiration in his voice overcoming any lingering pride. "You saved all of us." "We did it," she corrected, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You, too. You sacrificed your fortune." He smiled, a genuine smile, free from the weight of arrogance. "What is a fortune compared to this? I understand now what Dad meant. The true legacy isn't in the bank. It's here." He looked at her, the decision clear on his face. "The company needs a president, and that president is you. I would like, if you allow me, to handle the financial side, to be your advisor, to use what I know to help build, not to destroy." Brianna nodded, tears finally flowing down her face. "I'd love that, brother." It was the first time she had called him that. The words sealed the peace between them, resolving the conflict that had started everything. Ironclad Dynamics was saved. The Baston family was united, and a new future, forged in the fire of crisis and the strength of unity, was just beginning. 1 year later, the air at Ironclad Dynamics still smelled of hot oil and metal, but something fundamental had changed. There was a new energy in the hallways, a sense of purpose on the faces of the workers. They were no longer just employees, they were owners. The boardroom, once a stage for despair and humiliation, now housed the administrative council of the Ironclad Dynamics Cooperative. The long mahogany table was occupied not only by Brianna, Grant, and Mr. Montgomery, but also by Old Man Clarence, the master welder, and Inez, from logistics, democratically elected to represent the workers. Brianna, seated at the head, presided over the meeting with an innate calm and confidence. She didn't wear expensive suits, but simple, functional clothes. And her leadership came not from authority, but from the respect she had earned. Under her management, with Grant's financial acumen and Elias Thorne's strategic investment, the company had not only survived, but flourished. The focus shifted from short-term profit maximization to long-term sustainability and innovation. Cash flow was stabilized, debts restructured, and for the first time in years, the company operated at a profit. Part of that profit was reinvested in technology and training, and the other part was distributed as dividends to all co-owner partners. From the factory floor to the executive board, the story of Ironclad became a legend in the business world, a case study in universities on how human capital and trust could generate surprising profitability. After the meeting, Brianna walked onto the factory floor. She was not a stranger there. She knew everyone by name, asked about their families, listened to their suggestions. She stopped beside a new laser cutting machine, one of the many implemented improvements. Old man Clarence, now head of production, proudly explained its operation to a group of young apprentices. Grant found her there, bringing 2 cups of coffee. He was no longer the arrogant heir, but a calmer, wiser man. He found more satisfaction in building something solid than in chasing wealth for wealth's sake. "I remember when I found you standing here, looking at a safe," he said, handing her the coffee. Brianna smiled at the memory. "It feels like another life." "It was," he agreed, "a life where I thought a man's worth was in his net worth, in his stock market shares. I was wrong." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the dance of machines and people. Their father's legacy was not the industrial empire, but the community he, inadvertently, helped create. The true inheritance was not the money, but the values Brianna had rescued from oblivion: family, selflessness, fairness, and perseverance. Later that day, Brianna went to Mr. Montgomery's office. The old lawyer was tidying his books, preparing for a well-deserved retirement. On the desk, the portrait of Arthur Baston seemed to smile. "He would be immensely proud of you," Mr. Montgomery said, "of both of you." He handed Brianna one last envelope he had found in Arthur's files. Inside, an old photograph. In it, a young Arthur and a beautiful woman smiled beside a '75 Plymouth Duster. On the back, her father's handwriting read, "The first investment, the beginning of everything. Helena, 10-22, 1975. Brianna held the photo, the final link to the past, the seed from which everything had grown. She left the office and went to the window overlooking the factory yard. The late afternoon sun gilded the metal and the tired but satisfied faces of the workers finishing their shift. She was no longer a janitor, nor an accidental heiress. She was the guardian of a legacy, the leader of a family. She had found her place, not through an inherited fortune, but through the strength she had discovered within herself. The wealth she now possessed could not be counted in dollars or Bitcoin, but in the resilience of the human spirit and the certainty that, together, they could forge any future.